Hi, my name is Sarah and I'm 29 years old. I've been married to Dave for just 2 years and I wish I could tell you that it's been nothing but happiness. But honestly, it's been anything but smooth. And a big part of that has nothing to do with Dave himself but with his mother Eleanor. Let me back up a little. I met Dave while working at a small marketing firm. He was charming, kind and funny. We bonded over late-night pizza in the office and long talks about life. He didn't come across like someone who came from money, but he did a lot of it. His family owns one of the largest real estate companies in the city. Something I only found out months into dating him. Dave never made it seem like it mattered, so I didn't either. When he proposed, I was over the moon. I wasn't marrying his family, I was marrying him, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down I was already worried. Why? Because I'd heard whispers about his mother Eleanor, cold, snobbish and obsessed with family image. I first met Eleanor at our engagement dinner. She sized me up the second I walked in like I was a pair of shoes she'd never be caught dead wearing. Dave squeezed my hand under the table, silently reminding me to stay calm. Eleanor didn't say much that night, but what she didn't say was louder than words. No compliment on my dress, no welcome to the family, just polite, forced smiles. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe she just needed time. But it only got worse after we got married. Eleanor began organizing weekly family dinners. She called them exclusive gatherings, and by exclusive I found out the hard way she meant I wasn't invited. The first time Dave told me about it, I thought he was joking. What do you mean I'm not invited? I'm your wife. Dave rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. She says it's just family. I am family. I know, babe, but you know how my mom is. She's old-fashioned. She thinks these dinners are for the bloodline only. It's nothing personal. But it was personal. Every Sunday Dave would leave, dress nicely, and head to the family mansion while I stayed home pretending it didn't bother me. But it tore me up inside. What kind of family excludes their daughter-in-law like that? I tried to talk to Dave about it, but he always brushed it off, saying just give her time. 2 years passed and nothing changed. What's worse is that Eleanor made sure I knew I wasn't welcome. One evening, after bumping into her at the grocery store, she leaned in close and whispered, "You don't belong to this exclusive group, you should have dinner with people of your own kind." Then she gave me that cold, victorious smile like she'd won some kind of battle. I blinked, frozen. Did I just hear that right? My chest felt tight, my stomach churned, but I forced myself not to break down there and then. I told Dave later that night, but instead of getting angry like I expected, he sighed. "Sarah, she's just set in her ways. You're defending her after what she said." "I'm not defending her, I don't want to start a war, you know how she is." That night I cried myself to sleep, not because of Eleanor but because Dave didn't stand up for me. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out from a family friend that Eleanor had started introducing Dave to wealthy women at these dinners. Yes, you heard that right. She wasn't just excluding me, she was shopping for a replacement. The humiliation and betrayal made me feel like I was drowning, but I held it together barely. Felt like I was stuck. Should I fight hard or should I walk away? I loved Dave, but was love enough if I was always going to be treated like this? I didn't have the answer, not yet. What I didn't know then was that something, or rather someone, was about to turn my entire world upside down. Because the next Sunday at one of those exclusive family dinners, a man none of them had ever seen before would show up. He'd be dressed sharply, speak with confidence, and simply say, "I'm looking for my daughter." And just like that, everything would change. The next Sunday rolled around like clockwork. Dave dressed up like he always did for these family dinners, straightened his tie in front of the mirror and kissed me on the forehead. He didn't say much, but I could tell he knew I was still hurting. I was always hurting, yet like every week I forced a smile and waved him off. But this Sunday wasn't going to be like the others. Dave later told me that the evening started out the same way it always did. Eleanor was seated at the head of the long, extravagant dining table, surrounded by her exclusive circle. Dave's siblings, cousins, and their wealthy spouses. The usual chatter filled the room, champagne glasses clinked and laughter echoed from people who had made it their hobby to pretend I didn't exist. That is, until the stranger walked in. According to Dave, the room went silent the moment the door swung open. A tall man, well-dressed with silver hair and piercing eyes, stepped confidently into the dining room as if he owned the place. He didn't knock, he didn't ask permission, he simply walked straight up to the table. "Good evening," the man said smoothly. "I'm looking for my daughter." Eleanor blinked, visibly thrown off. "I beg your pardon." Dave told me later that everyone exchanged confused glances, whispering to each other. Eleanor straightened her back and said, "I think you have the wrong house." But the man didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Dave. "You must be Dave," he said. Dave stiffened a yes. The man chuckled. Then I am in the right place. Eleanor's face turned pale. She shot a look at Dave like he was supposed to know what was going on. Dave could barely get a word out before the man continued. My name is Edward Hayes. I'm Sarah's father. The room fell completely silent. I only heard about this later that night when Dave came home looking like he had seen a ghost. He barely took off his coat before blurting it out. Sarah, who is Edward Hayes? I froze. Edward Hayes wasn't just anyone, he was my biological father. But I had never met him. I knew about him from old documents and from what little my mother had told me before she passed away. He had been a wealthy businessman who, for reasons I never fully understood, was absent for most of my life. I never tried to contact him. I didn't want to. My mother raised me on her own and I never felt the need to go looking for the man who wasn't there. But now he had found me. Why was he at the family dinner? I whispered, still processing it. Dave ran a hand through his hair. I don't know, he just showed up, said he was your father, and left after telling Eleanor that he would speak with you soon. Everyone was shocked. Eleanor was furious, of course she was. This was the same woman who had humiliated me for being common, who treated me like an outcast because I wasn't born into wealth. And now the man claiming to be my father was a billionaire who made even Eleanor's fortune look like pocket change. But something didn't sit right with me. Why now? Why after all these years? The next morning I got my answer. I was at home sipping coffee trying to make sense of it all when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there he was, Edward Hayes, standing in front of me, looking nothing like the absentee father I had imagined. He looked kind nervous even. Sarah, he said gently, may I come in? My heart pounded. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. We sat in the living room and for a while neither of us said anything. Then finally he broke the silence. I've been looking for you for years. I didn't want to disrupt your life, but when I learned you married into the Lancaster family, I couldn't stay away any longer. The Lancaster family. Yes, he sighed. Eleanor and I have history. My stomach dropped. What do you mean, what kind of history? Edward's expression darkened. Let's just say that her obsession with status has hurt more people than you know, including me. I didn't know what to say. Suddenly all the humiliation, all the exclusion, the cruel words, they seemed to be part of a much deeper story I knew nothing about. Edward reached into his pocket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of my mother, much younger, standing next to Edward. They looked happy. She never told me about you, I whispered. I know, he said softly. And I'm sorry for that. But now I'm here and I won't let her hurt you anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. But I also knew this wasn't just about me anymore. There was something darker underneath, something about Eleanor's past and the reasons why she despised me from day one. And deep down I felt that this was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Edward's visit kept replaying in my head. His words, that picture of him with my mother, the way he said Eleanor has hurt more people than you know. It all felt too big, too overwhelming. The next morning I stared at my phone for a long time before finally calling my best friend Rachel. I told her everything. Rachel had always been my voice of reason, and after hearing me out she didn't hesitate. Sarah, you need to find out the whole story. Something tells me this runs deeper than you think. I knew she was right, but where was I supposed to start? My mother had passed away years ago and I had no other family to turn to. The only person who could give me answers was Edward. Later that day Edward invited me to lunch at a quiet little cafe on the edge of town. When I arrived he was already seated, waiting patiently, looking like a man who had aged too much too fast. As I sat down he gave me a small, almost shy smile. Thank you for coming. I need answers, I said, cutting straight to the point. He nodded. You deserve them. Over the next hour Edward told me everything. He and Eleanor had once been in love, deeply in love. But Eleanor's family disapproved. They were wealthy, influential, and ruthless. Edward came from a modest background back then and Elena's parents forbade the relationship. But Eleanor, young and defiant, stayed with him anyway. Until the day she didn't. She broke it off, Edward said quietly, without warning, without a word. I didn't understand why until much later. My heart pounded. Why? Because she found someone wealthier, someone who could offer her the status her family demanded. That man later became her husband, Dave's father. I sat there in disbelief. Eleanor didn't just abandon Edward, she traded love for power. Edward continued. Your mother Olivia was my friend back then. We were close after Eleanor left me. Olivia helped me pick up the pieces. One thing led to another and eventually we fell in love. We had you, Sarah. I felt tears sting my eyes. So you knew about me all along. Edward hesitated. Yes, but Ellen's family made sure I stayed away. They blackballed me in business, destroyed every opportunity one had. I couldn't even provide for you and your mother the way I wanted. I knew if I stayed close they would make your lives miserable. I left to protect you. I sat there stunned. My whole life I believed I was just unlucky. I thought I was excluded from Eleanor's world because I wasn't born into money. But the truth was I was the living reminder of the man she once loved but abandoned. It was never about me being less, it was about me being him. Edward placed a gentle hand on mine. I didn't mean to show up like that at the dinner, but when I saw what Eleanor was doing to you I couldn't stay silent. The weight of his words crushed me. Everything made sense now. The cold looks, the exclusion, the constant reminders that I didn't belong. Eleanor didn't hate me because I wasn't rich, she hated me because I reminded her of the life she turned her back on. I left the cafe with my head spinning. I wanted to talk to Dave about it, to tell him everything, but when I got home he wasn't there. Instead I found a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to Mother's family dinner. Family dinner without me again. That night I stared at my ceiling wondering if Dave ever noticed how much pain I had been swallowing all this time. Did he see how small I felt every time he left me behind for those dinners? How lonely it was eating frozen dinners by myself while they drank champagne. And now that I knew the truth, what was I supposed to do? The next morning Edward called me again. His voice was steady but I could hear a hint of determination. Sarah, I think it's time you take back your place at that table. I almost laughed through my exhaustion. How they've made it clear I don't belong. Oh, but you do, Edward said firmly. And next week you will. I didn't know what he meant yet. I only knew one thing. For the first time in years I wasn't just surviving this family's cruelty, I was going to confront it. What I didn't realize was that Edward's plan wouldn't just shake Eleanor, it would rock the entire family and me. I was finally ready. The following days passed in a blur. I went through the motions, work, home, repeat, but my mind was stuck on Edward's words. Take back your place at that table. What did he mean? How could I possibly walk into that house after everything they had done to me? I hadn't told Dave anything yet. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I could. Lately it felt like there was a wall between us. I didn't know if it was because of his mother's influence or if Dave himself was slowly becoming just like them, cold, distant, dismissive. By Thursday I was sitting in Edward's office downtown. It was nothing like I had pictured. His company was housed in one of the tallest buildings in the city, but the space itself felt warm and inviting. It didn't scream wealth, it whispered it, which somehow made me trust him even more. Edward leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Sarah, there's a charity gala happening this Saturday. It's being hosted by Eleanor and her social circle. I happen to be one of the main donors. My eyes widened. You're sponsoring it? He smiled slightly. More like I'm one of the people making it happen. And you, Sarah, will be attending. I immediately shook my head. Edward, the first can't. If Eleanor sees me there she'll have no choice but to acknowledge you, he interrupted calmly. This is not a Lancaster family dinner she controls. This is a public event, and more importantly it's my event. I swallowed hard. The thought of walking into that room made my stomach turn. But Dave, should I tell him? Edward paused, then said carefully. If you trust him. I wasn't sure I did anymore. So I found myself saying yes. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in Edward's voice, maybe it was the years of humiliation catching up to me, but I knew I couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. When Saturday came, Edward sent a driver to pick me up. He also sent a dress, a stunning deep green gown that made me feel like I had stepped out of a magazine. I had never worn anything so elegant in my life. As I stood in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back, and for the first time in a long while I felt like I deserved to be seen. The gala was held at one of the most exclusive hotels in the city. The ballroom was dripping with luxury crystal chandeliers, golden details, soft classical music in the background. The guest list AO who of the city's wealthiest and most influential, and somewhere among them was Eleanor. When I arrived, Edward was waiting for me at the entrance. He smiled proudly. You look just like your mother. That almost broke me right then and there, but I held it together. Edward offered his arm and together we walked into the ballroom. Heads turned instantly. Whispers followed as people tried to place me. I could feel their eyes on me like spotlight, but with Edward by my side I didn't flinch. And then I saw her, Ellen. She was standing near the stage holding a glass of champagne surrounded by her usual circle of admirers. When her eyes landed on me she froze. The glass slipped slightly in her hand and I swore I saw her face pale. Sarah, Dave's voice called out. I turned and saw him approaching from across the room. His expression was a mixture of shock and confusion. He hadn't known I'd be here. I almost crumbled under the weight of it, but Edward gently squeezed my arm. "Stay strong," he whispered. Dave reached me quickly. What are you doing here? Why didn't you tell me?" I took a shaky breath. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want me to come." "Of course." He glanced nervously toward his mother. "Sarah, you know how she gets." I stepped back. "Exactly." Before Dave could say more, Edward raised his voice slightly. "Excuse me, everyone," he called out, grabbing the attention of the entire room. He pulled me closer. "I'd like to formally introduce my daughter, Sarah Hayes." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I caught Eleanor's horrified expression as she stumbled backward, grabbing a nearby chair for support. Her friends murmured around her eyes darting between me and Edward. In that moment, I wasn't just the excluded wife anymore. I was Edward Hayes' daughter, and suddenly I mattered to them. But I wasn't there for their approval. I was there for me. Dave stood frozen, looking like he didn't know whether to apologize or run. Eleanor was visibly trembling, realizing she had underestimated me. I kept my chin up, forcing back every emotion swirling inside me. Because deep down I knew this was far from over. The following morning, the city's social pages were buzzing. Photos of the gala flooded social media. The headlines all read the same. "Edward Hayes' daughter revealed at Lancaster Gala." The comments were even worse. Words like hidden scandal and betrayal were thrown around like confetti. Eleanor's carefully curated world was unraveling right before her eyes. I woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages, most of them from Dave. I wasn't ready to answer him, not yet. I needed time to breathe. Edward, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He called me early and simply said, "Meet me for brunch, we need to prepare." Prepare for what? I asked. For the storm, of course. When I arrived, Edward already had coffee waiting. He slid a newspaper across the table. There it was, Elon's shocked expression on the front page. "Your mother-in-law isn't going to take this quietly," he said calmly. "But you, Sarah, you don't need to hide anymore." I stared at the image. For the first time, I wasn't the humiliated one in the room. Eleanor was. Edward went on. "She will come after you, maybe even after me. But I need you to remember something. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You did nothing wrong." I nodded slowly, feeling a strange mixture of fear and relief. I wasn't sure I believed him fully yet, but I wanted to. Later that day, I finally agreed to meet with Dave. He showed up to our apartment looking worn down, like he hadn't slept. As soon as he stepped inside, he started rambling. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say you were Edward Hayes' daughter?" I crossed my arms. Would it have made a difference? Yes, I don't know, maybe. He ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate. "It's just, you know how my mother is." "Exactly, Dave, that's the problem. You know how she is, and yet you've let her treat me like garbage for 2 years. He looked away. I swallowed hard, holding back the tears. "You let me eat dinner alone every Sunday while you smiled at her table. Do you even realize how humiliating that was for me?" "Sarah, I thought you could handle it. I thought if we just waited it out." "That's just it," I snapped. "Why should I have to handle it? Why didn't you ever stand up for me?" He didn't answer. I shook my head. "I'm tired, Dave. I'm tired of fighting for a place in your life when you won't even defend me to your own family." He tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. "I'm sorry, Dave, but I'm done." Dave's eyes widened. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not going to be part of this cycle anymore." He didn't argue. He just stood there watching me crumble and somehow still choosing silence. The next day, Eleanor struck back. She sent me an invitation, not to a family dinner but to a private meeting. In her handwriting, it simply said, "Let's settle this." Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part knew I needed to face her. When I arrived at the Lancaster estate, Eleanor was already seated in the grand dining room, sipping tea like nothing had happened. The same room I had been excluded from so many times. "Sit," she said without looking up. I did. Eleanor didn't waste time. "You embarrassed me publicly." I clenched my jaw. "You embarrassed me for 2 years." Her eyes narrowed. "I didn't know who you were. You knew enough to decide I wasn't worthy." She set her teacup down. "You don't understand how these things work." "No," I said firmly. "You don't understand. Respect isn't reserved for the wealthy. It's basic human decency." Eleanor leaned back, studying me. "Do you really think Edward is your savior? He's still the same foolish man who thought love was enough, just like you." I didn't flinch. "Then I'd rather be foolish than cruel." For the first time, I saw something crack behind Elon's eyes. Fear, regret, I couldn't tell. Before I left, she spoke again. "You'll regret this." I turned back to her. I regret ever believing I needed your approval. I walked out, leaving the cold, empty mansion behind. Outside, Edward was waiting in his car. When I got in, he simply asked, "How did it go?" I exhaled. I think I'm finally free. But deep down I knew Eleanor wasn't done, not yet. I thought walking out of that mansion would be the end of it, that finally I could breathe again. But I underestimated Eleanor. 2 days later, Edward called me. "She's planning something," he said calmly. "I just got word she's throwing an emergency family dinner this Saturday, no doubt to regain control." I wasn't surprised. Eleanor had always been the kind of person who couldn't stand losing face. But now I wasn't the same woman who used to sit at home waiting for scraps of her acceptance. I wasn't going to hide. Edward gently offered. "You don't have to go, you know." But deep down I knew I did. That Saturday I dressed simply but elegantly. Nothing flashy, but enough to make me feel like myself. Edward didn't come this time. He said this was a moment I needed to face alone, but he'd be nearby if I needed him. When I arrived, the entire family was already gathered. The long dining table was full, but somehow a seat was left vacant next to Dave. All eyes turned to me. I walked in calmly, my head high even though my heart was racing. Dave looked up from his plate, his eyes filled with something like guilt or maybe just helplessness. Eleanor, on the other hand, wore a chillingly pleasant smile. "Sarah," she said smoothly. "So glad you could join us." I said nothing as I sat down. Dinner was tense. Eleanor carried on with small talk, pretending like nothing had happened. Everyone followed suit, as if ordered to ignore the bombshell that had rocked their world a few days ago. But I could feel it, the cracks forming beneath the surface. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor put down on her fork and looked directly at me. "Since you're here, dear, I think it's time we clear the air." The room went quiet, even Dave straightened up. Eleanor continued. "I admit I may have been too protective of our family. I did what I thought was best. I narrowed my eyes. By excluding me, by insulting me every chance you got." Her smile faltered. "You have to understand." "No," I interrupted. "You have to understand. For 2 years I tried to earn a place here. I tried to be kind, patient, respectful, and you treated me like I was dirt beneath your shoes." Gasps echoed softly around the table. Eleanor's lips tightened. "We don't air family matters in public, Sarah." I stood up. "No, you just hide them behind closed doors." Dave stood too. "Sarah, please." I turned to him. "No, Dave, I need to say this. I deserve to." I faced Eleanor again. "You judged me because you saw me as someone beneath you, not because of who I am, but because of what I supposedly lacked. But you never saw the truth. I didn't need your approval, I just needed you to treat me like a human being." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but another voice cut in. "I believe that's enough, Eleanor." Every head turned as Edward walked into the room. Uninvited but entirely composed. He adjusted his cufflinks as if he had all the time in the world. "This is a private dinner," Eleanor hissed. Edward smirked. "Not anymore." He walked to the head of the table and addressed the entire room. "For years I let Eleanor control the narrative, but that ends tonight. I won't stand by while she humiliates my daughter, and by the way, for those who don't know, yes, Sarah is my daughter, and no, this family has no right to treat her as anything less than who she is." Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Eleanor turned pale. "You have no right." Edward cut her off. "Actually, I have every right. I'm one of the largest stakeholders in the Lancasters investment fund. I funded your precious estate renovations. Half the people in this room have benefited from my generosity without knowing it came from me." Dead silence. Edward turned to me. "Sarah, you don't owe them anything." In that moment I realized the weight I had been carrying wasn't just about the dinners or the snide comments. It was about constantly asking for love and respect from people who were never willing to give it. I took a deep breath. "You're right." Without another word I turned and walked out. Dave called after me, but I didn't stop. Edward followed me outside, offering me his arm. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. The wind felt different that night, lighter. In the following weeks Eleanor tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Many of the investors quietly pulled back once Edward exposed the truth. Even some family members distanced themselves, embarrassed by her cruelty. Dave reached out more than once, begging for another chance, but I never replied. I knew now that love without respect is empty. I didn't need Eleanor's acceptance, and I didn't need Dave's silence. I moved forward stronger, freer, and surrounded by people who actually cared about me. And the most important thing, I stopped apologizing for wanting to be treated like I mattered for.